let's see. Okay, so this is my AirPod microphone, and then here is my fancy one. Let me see if I can. Okay, I may need to. I just got a new computer yesterday, so let me just set that up real quick. I can't hear you now. Weird. Speaker.
Hey, Don, do you
Yes.
want me to introduce you as Donald and then use Don throughout?
Yes.
Or do you want to be Donald the whole time?
No, nobody called me Donald except my mother, and only when she was angry at me. So please call me Don.
Lovely. Thank you.
Kevin, how's the microphone situation?
Yeah, let me just see here. So output, it's not coming up. I can play with this for a minute, but I also, how do you hear, can you hear me okay right now?
We can, and I got to tell you, we have a great sound guy.
Okay.
So he's going to be working on all of our.
Great. So do we want to just, I could deal with this later because I just got this new computer yesterday. Let me just see. So let me just take one more minute, see if I can get it here.
Okay.
Apple icon, system preferences. Okay, well, if it's working fine, I think we could probably just go forward. And I can play with this afterwards. But as long as the audio sounds good enough for now.
It really does.
It's
Okay.
good.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Perfect.
I'll play with this later then. Let me unplug it just so it doesn't interfere.
Okay, I'm going to introduce both of you. Each we took from the bios you gave us and we condensed it a little bit. So I have a bio for each of you, a bio paragraph, and then a little about your book. And then I'll turn it over to Jonna to ask the questions. So sit tight. If you want to continue to play with your stuff, Kevin, you can. This will take a minute or two.
Take your time, yeah.
Okay. Welcome to this special episode of the Elevated Denver podcast. Before we wrap season 2, we wanted to take the opportunity to sit down with Don Burns and Kevin Adler to discuss their new book, When We Walk By, a thorough analysis of America's homelessness crisis and a rigorously researched solutions-based guide to ending it. Kevin Adler is an award-winning social entrepreneur, nonprofit leader, and author. Since 2014, he's served as the founder and CEO of Miracle Messages, a nonprofit dedicated to helping people experiencing homelessness rebuild their social support systems and financial security, primarily through family reunification services, a phone buddy program, and direct cash transfers, including one of the first basic income pilots for unhoused individuals in the U.S. Motivated by his late mother's work teaching at underserved adult schools and nursing homes, and his late uncle's 30 years living on and off the streets, Kevin believes in a future where everyone is recognized as invaluable and interconnected. Don Burns and his wife, Lynn, are the co-founders of the Burns Institute for Poverty Research at the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. Let's start that again. Sorry, guys. When we're in the podcast studio, we're often like, yeah, say that again. Go for another sentence that didn't quite as well as it should. And probably I need to redo. No, you don't think? Our podcast guy says he wants 2 takes every time. No. Don Burns and his wife, Lynn, are the co-founders of the Burns Institute for Poverty Research at the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. A local philanthropist concerned with the issues of homelessness and housing, Don served on the State Interagency Advisory Group on Homelessness for former Governor John Hickenlooper, and in a similar position for former Governor Bill Ritter. Don has also been an executive director for various nonprofits, a historian, researcher, and educational policy consultant for the U.S. Congress around issues of homelessness and poverty for over 35 years. He's the co-author of Journeys Out of Homelessness and A Nation in Denial, and is a co-editor and contributing author to Ending Homelessness. Through their book, When We Walk By, Don and Kevin introduced the idea of relational poverty, a dangerous form of isolation and loneliness commonly experienced by our unhoused neighbors. Say that again. A dangerous form of isolation and loneliness commonly experienced by our unhoused neighbors. The book delves into the intersectional reasons everyday people become housing insecure, like eviction, domestic violence, racism, inadequate wages, medical emergencies, and inhumane criminal justice system. By weaving together intimate stories of individuals' journeys of homelessness, Kevin and Don help readers understand the true experience of homelessness. Welcome to the podcast. Woo.
Thanks for having us. Good to be with you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here.
So to start, why don't you tell us and the listeners why it was important to write this book?
Kevin, why don't you start?
Okay. Well, yeah, great to be with you. This book really is, for me, the culmination of the last decade, and I know for Don, for multiple decades of work on this issue and in this space. I feel, having led a nonprofit that helps our unhoused neighbors rebuild their social support systems and financial security, I felt that the stories that I've heard over the last decade have transformed my heart on this issue. I can no more see a person experiencing homelessness as a problem to be solved rather than as a person to be loved than I once was able to. So for me, we've shared a lot of stories in our work at Miracle Messages, but we haven't really taken time to examine the patterns and the through lines that connect those stories, and really linking them to the broader narratives of homelessness in the United States, the systems that are broken. So when I thought about the book that I wish existed 10 years ago, when I started this journey, I approached Don, and in his graciousness and his kindness, he offered to join me on a journey that I think both of us are really excited about as creating now one of the first trade books on this issue of homelessness.
I would add to what Kevin has said that there are a lot of books about homelessness. Most of them focus on what is often called the policy and economic perspective of the issue. Very few people talk about the human aspect of homelessness. And so for me, it's been a revelation to have a chance to talk about the humanity in this issue and the degree to which people experiencing homelessness lack the kind of networks of support they need And we who are in housing have such a negative relationship with those experiencing homelessness. That has got to change.
We could not agree more.
Thank you.
So, as you were kind of already talking about, you approach the content in the book from a policy and economic perspective, but also importantly from a human perspective. And in particular, you dig into the relational factors that contribute to homelessness. So why is that piece really important?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the lenses that we use in writing this book is around this idea of relational poverty. And relational poverty is a form of poverty. Think of isolation, loneliness, disconnectedness, and often a stigma and shame that makes it very hard to then form nurturing relationships. I think this is an important issue because it's often overlooked. When we think about homelessness, we think about the lack of housing, which is fundamentally part of the experience. But we don't necessarily think about what else may accompany it. And I would argue that isolation, loneliness, disconnectedness, and a stigma and shame are perhaps the most common attribute of homelessness, aside from the lack of stable housing. And when we think about how relationships in our own lives as housed people can get us through the day, get us through rough times, when we need someone to talk to, when we are between jobs, when we are going through a tough time, when we're leaving an unhealthy relationship, we turn to our community, we turn to our relationship social capital. And so for our neighbors experiencing homelessness who either don't have that or have lost that, or where the support and the relationships that they had may not have had the economic resources and other resources to withstand the challenges they're facing, it can be that much harder for those individuals to stay off the streets and to then get off the streets, even if they get housing. We hear a lot about people who maybe are placed in housing units, but then within weeks or months, there's a pretty high attrition rate. And a lot of that is, well, if you're just giving people four walls and a roof, is that enough to be fully human? And I would say that it's not. And I think none of us would be able to get by without the social capital that we rely on. And the last thing I'll say is just a stat that blew my mind. You know, right now in the United States, we have 1 out of every 2 Americans who are a paycheck away from not being able to pay rent. 47% of people saying they don't know where they get $400 for an unexpected emergency. And so at some point, you almost have to ask a question, given those harrowing stats, 1 out of 2 Americans a paycheck away from not paying rent, why aren't tens of millions of people homeless? Why aren't there more people experiencing homelessness? And I think what we're finding is family, friends, community, church, synagogue, mosque, informal economy, social capital relationships, doubling up, tripling up, having someone there to get by. That's making up the difference right now for half of the country. And so I think centering this, it's not a silver bullet. It's not to say this doesn't mean we need to stop investing in housing and other systems. But I think we have to look in the mirror on this issue, because it's not just about homelessness, it's about us as housed people and our relationships or lack thereof with our unhoused neighbors.
I love that, Kevin. And I wonder, Dawn, if you could just extrapolate a little bit more that linkage between relational poverty and financial poverty.
Well, as I have written before, one of the most universal characteristics of people experiencing homelessness is social isolation. And another way of describing it is a lack of social capital. There's a great quote in our book. I never realized I was homeless when I lost my housing, only when I lost my family and friends. People ask me, so who do you call at 2 o'clock in the morning if you have a crisis? Well, we all have people we can call. By and large, people experiencing homelessness don't have those people. And as Kevin has suggested, if I can't get to work, somebody will help me. Somebody in my network will help me get to work. If I'm sick, somebody will take care of my kids so I can go to the doctor. If there's a day off and I need particular help, my network of support will provide the resources for me. And so without those kinds of resources, people are in desperate shape financially for all kinds of reasons. And so it is critically important that we recognize that. The other thing that I would add in terms of the concept of relational poverty, Kevin's absolutely right. I mean, it really, on the one hand, it has to do with people experiencing homelessness. I would argue that, and Kevin referred to this, I would argue that we as housed people have a very poor relationship with people experiencing homelessness. So there's a second kind of relational poverty. And it's something that we need to recognize, and is something that we cannot allow to continue.
Yeah, really appreciate that. And as you know, that's one of our aims too through our work, is to really shed light on how interconnected we all are and how critical those relationships between housed and unhoused and really everybody, how important those relationships are. So I appreciate you kind of driving that home. So let's turn to some of the economic components of homelessness for a second. In your book, you write that there's a deficiency of 7 million affordable housing units in the U.S. So given that, what are some feasible alternatives? What do we do with that?
Let me, I mean, this is one of the parts of the book that I feel very strongly about. There is the National Low Income Housing Coalition has what they call the housing wage. And the housing wage is basically what you have to earn on an hourly basis to afford an average 2-bedroom housing unit without spending more than 30% of your income. There is no state in the country where the minimum wage equals the housing wage. And there are only 32, 33 counties, 1% of all the counties in the country, where the minimum wage will provide a housing wage for a 1-bedroom housing unit. So the cost of housing is astronomical, and it's getting worse. We have to figure out, how do we reduce the cost of construction? And part of that is some of the new techniques and technology, 3D printing of houses, what do we call them? The large boxes. We need to do more with that. We have to reduce the cost of the work on labor and so on and so forth in order to reduce the cost of construction. We have to increase the availability of tax credits so that developers will end up providing more in the way of low-cost housing. Certainly, zoning and land use regulations have to change. Most of the cities in this country have regulations that say that up to 80% of the land in their jurisdictions can only be used for single-family dwellings. How do you build multifamily dwellings if there's no space to do it? We've got to change those kinds of regulations. Tax credits are critically important. One of the problems with tax credits is they end in 20 to 30 years. We have to extend the life of tax credits, and we have to create more housing vouchers. So there are all kinds of ways that we can think about addressing the problem. A second issue is the minimum wage. We have to increase the minimum wage. Having a minimum wage at $7.25 simply is not going to provide a living wage for most people. So there are all kinds of issues that we have to think about in terms of changing the systems for providing housing for folks experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, thanks, Don. I think you point to some really concrete examples there, not only of solutions and things we need to look at to change, but also sort of the intersectionality of all of these systems. And we can't just think about housing, we have to think about land use, and we have to think about the minimum wage. So just pulling that thread for a minute and expanding to other systems, I would love for you all to talk to us about why it's important for us to really understand how housing insecurity intersects with all of these other systems. And you bring up foster care system, criminal justice system, and also systems of oppression like racism and homophobia. So maybe you could talk to us about that intersectionality and why that's a really critical component of understanding how we address this issue.
Kevin?
Sure. What jumps out to me is a system that sometimes doesn't get talked about a lot on this issue of homelessness that I want to just bring forward in the conversation is the intersection between homelessness and foster care. So in the United States right now, 1 out of every 3 children, young persons who age out of foster care, by the time they're 26 years old, will experience homelessness. And that number, over 1/3, skyrockets up to 60% when we talk about Black young people who age out of the foster care system. 3 out of 5 will experience homelessness by the time they're 26 years old. And we all, I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, if you're, you care about this issue, I think we'd all agree that, people experiencing homelessness, no one deserves to be homeless. No one, it's not an individual failing. There's systems that we're talking about. But my gosh, the next time you hear someone say something that is, well, they just choose to be homeless, or, well, what did they do wrong? Well, look at the foster care system. And I think what's significant about that, and it really intersects with our work and conversation around relational poverty, is I've had a conversation before with a leader in the foster care space where I said, what's the biggest determinant on whether a young person goes through the foster care system and manages to, get out and thrive and avoid experiencing homelessness versus someone who doesn't? And he said, does that child have someone who goes to bed at night and wakes up in the morning thinking of their well-being, who isn't paid to do so? And I'm like, well, at what point do we age out of the need to feel loved, to feel like we're somebody? And so I think it's important. I mean, it can feel very overwhelming if if you start with the systems chapters of this book, which come in section 2 on housing, income inequality, foster care, criminal justice system, healthcare, mental health, racism, discrimination, immigration. It can feel overwhelming. These are systems that we have to address as a nation. But I think if we start with the humanity aspects and think about how we treat people, Do we know our neighbors experiencing homelessness as neighbors, as problems to be solved, or as people to be loved? Are we perpetuating harmful stigmas around this idea of, well, if there's a self-made man and woman in our society, self-made person, does that mean if someone's poor or someone's unhoused, are they self-failed as an individual? I think we have to really dig deep into understanding how we're seeing our neighbors experiencing homelessness and whether we're in relationship or not. And my hope is by doing that work and getting what Brian Stevenson from Equal Justice Initiative talks about of getting proximate, I would say getting relational. I think that will be the only thing I can think of that I know has worked in my life for people, a groundswell of people to say, this is unacceptable. We need to fight and advocate for the systems changes that are required, not because it's this abstract thing, but because these are our moms and dads, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters. And so that's the bridge that we're really trying to cross, I think, through this work.
So, sorry, Don.
One addition to what Kevin mentioned, there was a experiment in New York City several years ago, I think 2014. And the experimenters took 5 families and for each of the families, identified one individual from that family who would dress up as somebody looking like they were experiencing homelessness. And they sat on the streets of New York City. And then asked the other members of the family who didn't know about this to walk by these folks several times during the course of the day. No one in those 5 families identified the person on the street as a member of their family. Because of the kinds of attitudes we have about people experiencing homelessness. And when they were all reunited at the end of the day, people were just horrified. But it's indicative of the kinds of things that Kevin is talking about and our attitudes.
Yeah, I really, that was a powerful example, and I appreciate you bringing that up here. And as you, I think both are aware, I know Dawn is well aware that our podcast, part of our aim there is really to try to cultivate a level of compassion and understanding and connectedness so that people see that we're all just neighbors in one community and humans in this world together. And you really go into that. And I'm wondering, what you both just talked about actually prompted me to want to ask you first. So what do we do? What do we do when we see an unhoused neighbor as we're driving by or walking down the street? How do we begin to build those relationships and cultivate more of that compassion as we walk through the world?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I can start things off on that, and would love to hear from you too, Don. This book, it's the title was very intentionally chosen. So it's When We Walk By, right? So it's all of us. It's a book about us as housed people, as much as it is a book about our unhoused neighbors. But reading this book, the answer is not, well, you're never going to walk by an unhoused neighbor again, and I always have something to say or to do. That's not realistic. I think what we're asking and inviting folks to do is to really consider what's going on when you walk by. Do you walk by? Are you busy? Are you going to work? Or you have a meeting? Or are you disengaging because of perhaps fear or stigma? Is there judgment that's coming up? So I came up with a fun little, acronym to think of. So 3 letters. So first letter is I. It stands for imagine. Taking some time to imagine the person who's experiencing homelessness, whether it's on your walk or thinking about the people who you don't see who are experiencing homelessness, which is actually the larger majority of folks look just like you and me, blend in, trying to do everything they possibly can to not be seen as a person experiencing homelessness, right? With all the stigma that accompanies that. So imagining someone as your neighbor, as someone's son or daughter, I think that does make a difference. Second one is connect, see. When you take time to connect, and it could be through a program like Miracle Messages. We offer a phone buddy program where we have volunteers around the world who have committed 30 minutes a week to have one-to-one phone calls and text messages, kind of like a Big Brothers, Big Sisters program for our unhoused neighbors. We have weekly support calls, and it's really a wonderful community. So wherever you are, right now we have a wait list of neighbors experiencing homelessness wanting volunteers and to participate in this phone buddy program. We don't have enough volunteers. So whether it's through a program like a phone buddy program, through visiting a soup kitchen, a local shelter, doing outreach, finding a way to connect with an unhoused neighbor, as not a problem to be solved, as a person to be loved. And the first is to unite, to see the us and them dichotomy as totally inaccurate. We wouldn't call each other housed people in regular discourse, like it's a silly identity. And yet we've grouped everyone who's on the streets by their lack of one physical need. And that's housing. So I think to unite the experiences of what we hear from the people we meet to the broader systems that are broken around income inequality. What does it mean if you just are working as one out of every two unhoused individuals works, who are based in shelters, has jobs, but still not enough to afford housing in the United States? What does it mean if you've served a sentence in a jail or prison and you've been released to the streets, and because of your felony record, you cannot get a job, you cannot get housing, you're not eligible for federal benefits, you've already been disconnected from your family. So I think getting close enough to the issue to get to know our unhoused neighbors and then connect the experiences that they may be going through with some of these wider issues, and then being able to advocate for them. So it stands for I see you. And I think that's an easy way for folks to remember is just the importance of seeing our neighbors as neighbors and starting there.
I wanted to add to that a short story. I was at a traffic light here in Denver, and there was a guy on the sidewalk with his cardboard sign that said, I'm not cute enough to get housing. And I looked at him, young guy, pretty well dressed actually. And I rolled down my window and said, I'm sorry, but I don't have anything to give you. But I think you are cute enough. And he laughed and slapped his leg and said, that's the best thing I've heard all week. It didn't take much. Rolling down my window and making connection. And this is this is the C that Kevin was talking about. We need to connect with people. At a soup kitchen, don't just ladle out food. Go and sit down with people and talk to them. Get to know them. I agree with Kevin. You don't have to say hi to everybody who's on the street, but think about it and maybe stop and say, hey, how you doing? How's your day been? And I've gotten to the point now where if I'm in a position to do so, I will at least wave at everybody who is panhandling at a corner. I may not stop and give them anything, but at least I recognize them and acknowledge their existence, which strikes me as being an important step for all of us.
Yeah, and if I can, the last thing I'll just jump in on is, socks are number one requested item for many of our unhoused neighbors on the streets. Giving out socks is a great conversation starter. Keeping some socks in your trunk or having some on hand as a way of starting that conversation, as Don has suggested. But again, I think recognizing that the folks that we see as experiencing homelessness do not comprise the majority of our neighbors experiencing homelessness, and being able to invest in programs like basic income, where and we have a wonderful project that Mark Donovan is running here in Denver, Denver Basic Income Project, and programs like that, programs like our Miracle Money program, Miracle Messages. We're finding that when you give people money directly, they tend to use that money very well. In fact, probably better than we could have used it for them. In our initial pilot, we gave out $500 a month for 6 months to 14 individuals, and 2/3 of them were able to secure housing within 6 months. And so we're doing a randomized control trial, $2.1 million expansion of that. I know there's basic income, direct cash transfer pilots, popping up around the country. But I think the question we have to ask is not, do we spend money on this issue? Because we're already spending a lot of money on this issue. We've seen evidence that we cited in the book from HUD and other sources that, taxpayers may be spending as much as $40,000 to $80,000 per unhoused person per year to maintain someone on the streets for a year. Police, fire, emergency services, shelter system, sanitation. That's insane. So if we can get folks a dignified way of life, housed, being able to return as contributing members of society, stabilized for a fraction of that through something like a direct cash transfer program, why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we?
I want to add to something that Kevin just said, because this is one of the real idiosyncrasies of our economic system. It's cheaper to do the right thing in terms of providing housing and services for people experiencing homelessness than not to do anything, because of the kinds of costs that Kevin just articulated. Why aren't we doing it? And a lot of the reason for that is because we have such a negative feeling about those experiencing homelessness. We've got to change that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought us back there, Don, because that's something I'm sitting with you. In the book, you couldn't lay out a more compelling argument for why it's critical for us to connect to one another and what impact all of our interpersonal relationships have on all of our well-being and the impact on our outcomes in life. And yet we still sit with this truth that as a society, we are hesitant to, as you said, Don, do the right thing and provide people the choice and trust them that they will make the choices that are right for them when we give direct cash. And we're hesitant to provide the assistance to get people what they need when they need it. And why is that? What did you learn as you were writing this book about why that is? And of course, what do we do?
In addition to the book, I've been involved in a project looking at NIMBYism. And I come away from all of that with the almost certainty that there is a natural xenophobia about fear of people who are different. And it's race, it's class, it's sexual orientation, it's gender, it's immigration status, it's whatever, and it's housing status. People who are different, we're afraid of for whatever reason. And we have to figure out how to shift some of those gears.
Thank you. Kevin, anything to add?
Oh, I mean, so much. I was trying to respect your questions and your time. I'll just be brief. I mean, there's neuroscientists at Princeton and Duke that found that the part of our brain that activates when we see a person compared to an inanimate object, that part of the brain has been found not to even respond when we see someone that we perceive to be in an extreme outgroup in our society. And that includes our neighbors experiencing homelessness. So even at a neurological level, we're processing our unhoused neighbors not as our unhoused as neighbors, as problems. So there's really deep work that's needing to be done. Dawn and I in the book, and I think just as people, we've really tried to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers. And in fact, we walk by. There's enough self-righteousness out there on many issues. Homelessness, this isn't one where we need to perpetuate any kind of us versus them dichotomy. We open up the solutions chapter with the time that we too walk by and where we treated an unhoused neighbor in a biased or derogatory or disrespectful way, not because we're proud of those moments, but because those are real human moments. So my hope is that readers of the book will not feel talked down to, not feel additionally frustrated, because truthfully, after doing this work for the last 10 years and seeing lives transformed through relatively simple interventions like family reunifications, like a phone buddy program, like basic income, I actually feel more hopeful now than I did 10 years ago on this journey. And I'm seeing change. Some of the changes I think Dawn mentioned, at least awareness of the need for different housing policies, for the intersectionality of homelessness with a lot of the other systems we've talked about, for a wider embrace of various forms of housing, like tiny homes, modular homes, container homes. I think a good question that really we need to ask ourselves honestly as we talk about homelessness is, would that work for us if we were experiencing homelessness? God forbid, right? Would we be willing to be in an environment, shelter environment, where you have to get in by a certain time, get out by 7 a.m., you can't bring your stuff, you can't bring your partner, you can't bring your pets, you're congregated with a rotating group of people who you don't know, who are all clumped together just because of their shared lack of housing, but not necessarily with any mind towards other reasons became homeless, other identities you may have. So would you go in an environment like that? Well, probably not. Well, what if you were offered a space that's yours, that's a few hundred square feet? It's dignified. It has a lock on the door. You can have, loved ones over. I mean, it may not be an ideal existence forever, but it's better than the alternative. And so I do think there's a move to embrace a kind of yes and mindset when it comes to homelessness and stop fighting between this solution and that solution. There's no silver bullet to end homelessness. Relational poverty and housing are not silver bullets to end homelessness. But you have to start with housing, you have to start with relational poverty, and you have to address all these intersectional systems and humanity failings for us to actually have a fighting chance to see homelessness end in our lifetime.
People ask me, can we end homelessness? And my response is, there will always be a few people who are without homes for a certain period of time. But we certainly can make it very brief. We can make it very, very unusual. And we can make sure that we provide them with the kinds of immediate transitional shelter that they need. The other thing that makes me somewhat optimistic is looking at what happened when President Obama and the Secretary of the VA, Sean Donovan, got together and said, we're going to address veteran homelessness. Within 4 or 5 years, they reduced veteran homelessness by over 50%. That means that if you have the political will and the resources, you can accomplish a great deal. So if we can generate the political will that generates the kinds of resources that are needed, we could do much better than what we have already done in terms of all of the other subpopulations of people experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, thank you both. One thing we would add to that is when we are able to connect, as you all really bring forward in this book, and understand folks' experiences from the human lens, we can actually map onto that resources and supports that actually mirror those needs in a way that is effective.
Yeah, we
More
are pretty
effective.
good as human beings at problem solving and being relational. Like it's kind of fundamental to the human experience. And the trick is we just aren't in a position, or we don't put ourselves in a position to be in those kinds of relationships. But I've been astounded through our Phone Buddy program what kinds of solutions and suggestions and navigating complex systems the volunteer, relatively untrained individuals are able to do as friends to just navigate together. No one can go through no one should go through homelessness alone any more than no one can go through life alone. So I totally agree that if we're centering the importance of relationships, reconnecting as people, I have no doubt that we'll come up with, solutions that really aren't just top down. I think we've talked on this program a lot about the systems that are broken. Person by person, you have to know someone's name. You have to know the situation, the story. If you have 600,000 people experiencing homelessness in the United States, there's 600,000 reasons why every night that person's on the streets. And until we get close enough to hear the specific context for that person and then work with them to connect them to resources, support, programs that address their unique situation, we won't get on top of this issue.
One of the many things that Kevin has taught me over the last several years is the wonderful phrase, everyone is someone's somebody. And if we can acknowledge that everybody is a father, is a mother, is a brother, sister, cousin, nephew, niece, etc., etc. Everybody is a human being. And if we can only remember that when we look at folks who are experiencing homelessness, yes, they are part of somebody's family. And we need to remember that.
Yeah, thank you both. Before I turn it over to Leanne to just bring us out for today, is there anything else? I'm sure we could talk for hours. And also, every time I ask a question, you leave with such an amazing home run of a response that I imagine you could go on forever, and you've hit it out of the park already. Is there anything else you want to leave the listeners with as it pertains to the issue at large or the book?
I'll share one final thought, and I'd love to hear Don's as well. Well, probably once every couple months, I get a message from another friend or acquaintance that I'm connected with on social media. And the message usually goes something like this: Kevin, I read your work. I saw your recent video. I saw the announcement of your book launch. Congratulations. I've never shared this with you before, and I've never shared this with anyone, but I too experienced homelessness. Growing up with my mom, we had a tough time. In between jobs after college, I was an entrepreneur, I was a founder, and my first startup didn't go quite where we wanted it to. I didn't have much money. I had a falling out. And the messages always end with the same thing: please don't tell anyone that I too experienced homelessness. And these are folks who, some of whom are now successful founders, leaders of tech startups. These are folks who are C-suite executives at Fortune 100 companies. And yet still, they're so embarrassed, ashamed, nervous about sharing this experience that they'd rather stay closeted to this experience of homelessness than to share it openly. And so I think what we need to do is, first, if there's listeners out there who've had an experience of homelessness, or who have a friend or family member who's experienced homelessness, we desperately need to hear your stories. We desperately need you to speak, if it's safe to do so, to share that I too experienced homelessness. I too know what it's like. I too had this tough time. And until we do that, folks won't be able to think of a person in their networks who is the face and name of, wow, if so-and-so went through this, so could I, but for the grace of God go I. So I think if you haven't gone through homelessness, or you haven't experienced housing insecurity, sharing very openly where you're at on this issue. What questions do you have? What assumptions are you making? What don't you know? Are all people experiencing homelessness from an area, right? Is it how many people are addicted to drugs, substance abuse? Taking time to do some research and hopefully reading our book. It just came out, When We Walk By, and you get it at whenwewalkby.com. But wherever you're at on this issue, sharing your why, for why you care about this issue, why you care about this conversation, whether it's from personal experience, family, friend connections, or just because you're a good person and you're trying to do the right thing. I think that's really a critical first step in the narrative change and changing hearts and minds. That's not happening enough. We're allowing the conversation to be overtaken by the doom and gloom and by narratives of the homeless. And until we get to just the we talk about connecting. It's not just with our feet, it's with our fingers and what we type and what we write and what we share and what conversations we're willing to have online and offline with our loved ones. So that's what I would invite folks into, is those kinds of courageous conversations.
Kevin's comments reminded me that I just learned the other day that a good friend and colleague of mine who was on the Denver City Council for 12 years, probably should have run for mayor. She experienced homelessness, which I had no idea about. And how many more people would be in positions like that if we treated folks the way we should be treating them? How many wonderful people are we missing out on because we have such negative feelings about people? People say, oh, you bum, you get a job. Well, 45% of people experiencing homelessness are working. And I can go on and on and on about that. But we have got to shift gears in our thinking so that we treat people with the kind of love and respect that they deserve. We hope you read the book. We hope you are as inspired by it as we have been. And again, thank you, Jonna and Leanne, for letting us jabber away about this very important issue.
Thank you both for spending time with us today and for sharing your wealth of knowledge with our listeners. When We Walk By is foundational to understanding the complex issues of homelessness. We appreciate the person-first approach. We appreciate the person-first approach and the astute commentary on the intersectional web of homelessness. And we hope everyone will read this important book. Thank you.
Thank you both. What a pleasure this time has been, and reading the book, and can't wait for the launch event and to meet you live and in person, Kevin.
I'm looking forward to that. Thanks for having us. And Dawn, really nice to be in conversation with you here.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Take care, Kevin. I give my best to your lovely wife.
Okay.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.